They told him to wait. They told him the time wasn't right. They told him to be patient, to be reasonable, to stop causing trouble. But on a cold Birmingham night in 1963, sitting alone in a dark jail cell, Martin Luther King Jr. picked up a pen and wrote words that would shake America to its core. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. He wasn't just writing a letter. He was declaring war on silence, on comfort, on waiting. And what he wrote in that cell would change everything. But this story doesn't begin in a jail cell. It begins in a world where America called itself the land of the free while millions of its own people were not free at all. In the early decades of the 20th century, across the American South, black men, women, and children lived under Jim Crow laws. This was not just separation. This was a system designed to remind them every single day that their rights, their dignity, and their humanity were treated as less. It was a world where a 6-year-old black boy in Georgia played with his white friend until one day the white boy's parents said no more. White children and colored children were not allowed to play together. The friendship ended. The confusion and pain never did. It was a world where a black woman could board a bus, pay the same fare as everyone else, and then be forced to walk to the back door to enter. Where she could sit only in the colored section. Where empty seats reserved for white riders remained empty even as she stood, even as her feet ached, even as the bus was half empty. It was a world where two water fountains stood side by side. One labeled white. One labeled colored. One clean, one neglected. Same building. Same water. Different humanity. It was a world where speaking up could cost you your job. Where protesting could land you in jail. Where a single mistake, a wrong word, a moment of defiance, could cost you your life. Into this world, on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, a baby boy was born to a Baptist pastor and a church organist. They named him Michael King Jr. but soon his father, inspired by the great German reformer who stood against the powerful and said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," changed both their names. That child would grow up as Martin Luther King Jr. He was raised in a home where dignity was not negotiable. His father was a preacher who would walk out of any store that tried to make him use the back entrance. Who refused to be called boy by white salesmen. Who taught his son that no law, no custom, no tradition could make a child of God inferior. But lessons learned at home collided with a world designed to break that spirit. Young Martin began asking questions that adults couldn't answer. Why are there two water fountains? Why can't I sit in those empty seats? Why does my friend's mother say we can't play together anymore? Why do people hate us for our skin? These weren't philosophical questions. They were survival questions. Questions about whether he was fully human in the eyes of his country. He was brilliant, intellectually hungry, and restless with the world as it was. He skipped 2 grades and entered Morehouse College at just 15 years old. But he wasn't just collecting knowledge. He was building a framework for resistance. At Morehouse, he encountered Dr. Benjamin Mays, the college president who became his intellectual father. Mays taught him that education without purpose was meaningless. That faith without action was dead. That the measure of a person was not what they believed but what they did when belief demanded sacrifice. Martin read philosophy. He studied theology. He devoured the works of great thinkers. And then he discovered something that would change not just his life but the trajectory of American history. He discovered Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi had taken on the British Empire, the most powerful force on earth, and defeated it without firing a single shot. He had proven that oppression could be confronted not with violence but with truth. Not with hatred but with love. Not with bombs but with bodies willing to suffer rather than inflict suffering. Martin saw in Gandhi's philosophy a way forward. A way to fight without becoming what you fought against. A way to demand justice without surrendering the moral high ground. He continued his education at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where for the first time he lived outside the segregated South. He studied alongside white students. He debated. He challenged. He was elected president of the student body. Then he went to Boston University for his doctorate. And there, in Boston, he met a woman who would become his partner in every sense. Coretta Scott. Intelligent, independent, musically gifted, and as committed to justice as he was. They married in 1953. And in 1954, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. returned to the South as the new pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He was 25 years old. He had his doctorate. He had a beautiful wife. He had a promising career ahead as a respected preacher. He had no idea that in less than a year, history would come knocking on his door. And when it did, there would be no turning back. Montgomery, Alabama, 1955. The city was a textbook example of segregation in action. The bus system was where that segregation was most visible and most humiliating. Here's how it worked. The front 10 seats were for white passengers only. The back 10 seats were for black passengers. But the middle section, that was where the cruelty lived. If white passengers filled their section, the bus driver could order black passengers in the middle to stand up and move back. Even if they'd been sitting there first. Even if there were no seats left in the back. Even if elderly black women had to stand while young white passengers sat. And if you refused, you were arrested. Black passengers had to pay their fare at the front, then get off the bus, walk to the back door, and enter from there. Sometimes the driver would pull away before they could get on, taking their money with him. This wasn't just inconvenient. This was designed humiliation. A daily reminder that you were less than human. For years, black women in Montgomery had been organizing quietly. The Women's Political Council, led by Joe and Robinson, had been documenting abuses, planning strategies, waiting for the right moment. And then came December 1, 1955. Rosa Parks was not just a tired seamstress, though that's how the story is often told. She was a trained activist, secretary of the local NAACP, experienced in civil rights work. That summer, she had attended workshops on nonviolent resistance at the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. When she boarded the bus that evening and sat in the first row of the middle section, she knew exactly what she was doing. The white section filled up. Driver James F. Blake, who had thrown Parks off his bus years before, ordered her row to move. 3 people stood up. Rosa Parks stayed seated. "Are you going to stand up?" Blake demanded. "No," she said quietly. "Just that." "No." The police came. They arrested her. And as they led her away, something ignited in Montgomery's black community. That very night, Joe and Robinson and the Women's Political Council sprang into action. They produced 35,000 leaflets calling for a one-day bus boycott on December 5, the day of Parks's trial. E.D. Nixon, a longtime organizer, saw this as the moment they'd been waiting for. But he knew it needed leadership. Organized, sustained leadership. The black ministers of Montgomery met. They needed a president for the new organization they were forming, the Montgomery Improvement Association. Many of the established ministers had too much history, too many old conflicts. But there was this young pastor, new to town, educated, eloquent, not yet caught up in local politics. They chose Martin Luther King Jr. On December 5, the boycott was total. Buses rolled through black neighborhoods completely empty. People walked. They carpooled. They rode mules. They did whatever it took. That evening, thousands packed Holt Street Baptist Church. King had less than 20 minutes to prepare his speech. He stood before them knowing this was the defining moment not just of the boycott but of his life. He spoke for 15 minutes. No notes. Just conviction. He told them this was about dignity. About justice. About treating people as human beings. He told them they had the right to protest, the right to refuse, the right to say enough. And then he said something that would become his signature principle. We must meet violence with nonviolence. We must meet hate with love. The crowd erupted. They voted to continue the boycott until the buses were integrated. What they thought would last a few days turned into weeks. Then months. King became the target. His phone rang with death threats at all hours. He was arrested on trumped-up speeding charges. The pressure was crushing. One night in January 1956, alone in his kitchen, afraid for his family, King hit bottom. He prayed. And in that moment, he later said, he felt a presence telling him to stand up for righteousness. That he would never be alone. Days later, someone threw a bomb onto his front porch. His wife and baby daughter were inside. The bomb exploded. Miraculously, they were unharmed. A crowd of black men gathered outside, angry, some armed, ready for violence. King stood on his damaged porch and pleaded with them. Don't do it. We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us. We must make them know that we love them. The crowd dispersed peacefully. And the world saw that King meant what he said about nonviolence. Even when it was his own family under attack. The boycott lasted 381 days. The city fought back with arrests, fines, harassment. But the black community held firm. They walked. Some walked miles every day to work and back. Meanwhile, lawyers filed a federal lawsuit challenging bus segregation. In November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. On December 21, 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders boarded a Montgomery bus and sat in the front. The boycott was over. They had won. But this was just the beginning. King had proven something profound. That ordinary people, united by moral conviction, could bring down systems of oppression without violence. That suffering could be redemptive. That love could be a weapon more powerful than hate. The Montgomery bus boycott made King a national figure. But his greatest tests were still ahead. By 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was the face of the civil rights movement. But there was one city that represented everything wrong with America. One city where segregation was so entrenched, so violent, so absolute that even other Southerners called it extreme. Birmingham, Alabama. They called it Bombingham because of all the explosions targeting black homes and churches. The city's commissioner of public safety was a man named Bull Connor, whose very name struck fear. Connor controlled the police and fire departments and had made it clear that segregation would be defended by any means necessary. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference chose Birmingham deliberately. If they could break Birmingham, they could break segregation anywhere. They called it Project C, C for confrontation. The plan was simple and brutal. Organize sit-ins. March. Get arrested. Fill the jails. Create a crisis so severe the city would have to negotiate. But at first, it wasn't working. Adults were afraid to march. They had jobs to lose, families to feed. The jails were frightening. Bull Connor was unpredictable and dangerous. The campaign was stalling. And King made a decision that shocked even his closest advisors. On Good Friday, April 12, 1963, he announced he was going to march, knowing he would be arrested. His advisors begged him not to. The organization was running out of money. They needed him outside to fundraise, not inside a jail. King refused. He said sometimes you have to put your body on the line. Sometimes leadership means going first into the danger. He marched. He was arrested. And he was thrown into solitary confinement. While he was in that cell, 8 white Alabama clergymen published an open letter in the newspaper. They called King's demonstrations unwise and untimely. They said he should wait. Be patient. Not cause trouble. King was furious. These were supposed to be the good white people. The religious people. The moderates. And they were telling him to wait. He started writing in the margins of the newspaper. On scraps of paper. On anything he could find. What emerged was the letter from Birmingham jail, one of the most important pieces of writing in American history. He wrote that he was tired of the word, wait. That black people have been waiting for 340 years. That, wait, almost always meant, never. He wrote that there are two kinds of laws. Just laws and unjust laws. And that people have a moral responsibility to obey just laws and to disobey unjust laws. He wrote that the greatest obstacle to justice was not the KKK but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. He was done being polite. Done waiting for permission. Done asking nicely. Meanwhile, outside the jail, the campaign was still struggling. And then someone had an idea that would change everything. If adults were too afraid to march, what about children? On May 2, 1963, more than 1,000 black children, some as young as 6 years old, left their schools and marched toward downtown Birmingham. They sang freedom songs. They carried no weapons. Bull Connor arrested more than 900 of them. The jails were overflowing. The next day, May 3, more children marched. And this time, Bull Connor lost his mind. He ordered the fire department to turn high-pressure water hoses on the children. The force of the water was strong enough to tear bark off trees. It knocked children off their feet, slammed them against walls, sent them tumbling down the street. He released police dogs. German shepherds lunged at teenagers, tearing their clothes, biting their legs. And the cameras captured everything. Photos of children being attacked by dogs went on the front page of newspapers around the world. Footage of fire hoses knocking down young girls played on television in millions of homes. America could no longer look away. President Kennedy saw the images and said they made him sick. The business leaders of Birmingham, seeing their city's reputation destroyed and facing economic boycotts, finally agreed to negotiate. In early May, an agreement was reached. Birmingham would begin desegregating. Black employees would be hired. Prisoners would be released. King had won. But the victory came with a cost he couldn't have imagined. 4 months later, on September 15, 1963, Ku Klux Klan members planted a bomb at the 16th Street Baptist Church, the same church where the children had gathered to march. The bomb exploded during Sunday school. 4 girls were killed. Addie Mae Collins, 14 years old. Carol Robertson, 14. Cynthia Wesley, 14. Denise McNair, 11. King delivered the eulogy. His voice was heavy with grief. These children, he said, have something to say to every minister, every politician, every person of goodwill. They have something to say to America. They say that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them but about the system that created the conditions where murder was possible. Birmingham broke something open in America. The brutality was undeniable. The courage of the children was undeniable. And the moral clarity of Martin Luther King Jr. was undeniable. But the fight was far from over. In fact, the greatest moment was still to come. By the summer of 1963, Birmingham had awakened the nation's conscience. Cities across America were erupting in protests. The pressure on the federal government was mounting. And civil rights leaders decided it was time for the movement to march on Washington itself. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom was planned for August 28, 1963. The goal was to demand civil rights legislation, but also economic justice. Fair wages. Job opportunities. An end to poverty. Some people thought it was too risky. President Kennedy worried it might turn violent. Some activists thought it would accomplish nothing. But the organizers, led by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, pushed forward. Every major civil rights organization joined. The NAACP, SCLC, SNCC, CORE, The Urban League. For once, they were united. On the morning of August 28, buses, trains, and cars began pouring into Washington, D.C. from every corner of America. Black people and white people. Young and old. Rich and poor. Christians, Jews, people of every faith and no faith. By noon, more than 250,000 people filled the National Mall. It was the largest demonstration for human rights in American history. They gathered between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. The symbolism was deliberate. Lincoln had freed the slaves 100 years earlier. But black Americans were still not free. Martin Luther King Jr. was scheduled to speak last. The day had already been long. Speaker after speaker had addressed the crowd. People were tired. Hot. Restless. King approached the podium with a prepared speech in his hand. It was good. Strong. About the promissory note America had written in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. About how that check had come back marked insufficient funds for black Americans. He began reading. His voice was powerful but controlled. He talked about the fierce urgency of now. About not being satisfied until justice rolled down like waters. And then something unplanned happened. Behind King stood Mahalia Jackson, the greatest gospel singer in America and a close friend. She had heard King preach many times. She knew his greatest sermon, the one about the dream. As King was reading his prepared text, Mahalia called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." King paused. For just a moment. And then he did something that great preachers sometimes do. He set his written speech aside. He stopped reading and started preaching. "I have a dream," he said. And with those 4 words, everything changed. He spoke from his heart, from his soul, from the deepest wells of black church tradition. His voice rose and fell like music. The crowd began responding like a congregation. "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character." The crowd was electric. People were crying. Shouting. Holding each other. He kept going, building, building, building to the climax. When we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The mall erupted. It was the greatest speech in American history. Not because it was written that way. But because at the critical moment, King trusted his instincts, trusted his training, trusted the Spirit, and spoke the truth that was in his heart. Television cameras captured it all. Radio broadcast it. Newspapers printed it. The speech went around the world. Suddenly, everyone knew who Martin Luther King Jr. was. Everyone had heard the dream. The March on Washington changed everything. It showed the world that the civil rights movement was massive, peaceful, dignified, and morally right. President Kennedy, who had been cautious about supporting civil rights, now moved forward with legislation. When Kennedy was assassinated in November, President Lyndon Johnson took up the cause. On July 2, 1964, Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing segregation in public places and discrimination in employment. Martin Luther King Jr. stood beside him as he signed it. Later that year, in December 1964, King traveled to Oslo, Norway, to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. At 35, he was the youngest person ever to receive it. He didn't keep the prize money. He donated all of it to the civil rights movement. In his acceptance speech, he said something profound. "I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality." He refused to accept it. And because he refused, millions of others refused too. But there was still one more battle to fight. One more march to make. One more river to cross. The right to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a massive victory. But in much of the South, black people still couldn't vote. And without the vote, every other right was vulnerable. In Selma, Alabama, in Dallas County, black people made up more than half the population. But of 15,000 black residents of voting age, only 335 were registered to vote. The reason was simple. Terror. When black people tried to register, they were given impossible literacy tests. Asked absurd questions like, "How many bubbles are in a bar of soap?" They were threatened. Fired from their jobs. Beaten. Some were killed. Local activists had been working for years to register voters. But progress was almost non-existent. They invited King to Selma, hoping his presence would draw national attention. King arrived in January 1965. He led marches to the courthouse where registration took place. Sheriff Jim Clark, nearly as brutal as Bull Connor, arrested them by the hundreds. King himself was arrested and jailed. While he was in jail, a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot by state troopers during a peaceful march in a nearby town. He died 8 days later. His death sparked a plan. March from Selma to Montgomery, the state capital, 54 miles away, and present their demands to Governor George Wallace. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, about 600 people gathered at Brown Chapel in Selma. King was in Atlanta that day, but the march went forward, led by John Lewis of SNCC and Hosea Williams of SCLC. They marched out of Selma toward the Edmund Pettus Bridge. As they reached the bridge and started across, they saw a wall of state troopers on the other side. The marchers kept walking. They were unarmed. Peaceful. Singing hymns. When they reached the other side, a voice came over the bullhorn. "This is an unlawful assembly. You have 2 minutes to disperse." They didn't even get 2 minutes. The troopers charged. They swung clubs. They beat people to the ground. They trampled them with horses. They fired tear gas. John Lewis's skull was fractured. Dozens were hospitalized. People ran back across the bridge, bloodied, gasping for air, terrified. ABC was showing a movie that night, Judgment at Nuremberg, about Nazi war crimes. The network interrupted the movie to show footage from Selma. America watched state troopers beating unarmed Americans on a bridge. It was called Bloody Sunday. The reaction was immediate and explosive. King called clergy and citizens of conscience to come to Selma. Within 48 hours, people flooded in from across the country. 2 days later, on Tuesday, March 9, King led about 2,500 people to the bridge. But this time, he faced a dilemma. A federal judge had issued an order temporarily blocking the march. King didn't want to defy a federal court. When they reached the other side of the bridge, King stopped. He knelt in prayer. And then he turned the marchers around. Some people were furious. They called him a coward. They said he had betrayed the movement. But King knew that maintaining the moral high ground meant respecting the law when possible, even when it was frustrating. That night, white racists attacked a white minister from Boston named James Reeb who had come to support the march. They beat him with clubs. 2 days later, he died. President Johnson was outraged. He went before Congress and gave one of the greatest presidential speeches on civil rights. He invoked the movement's anthem. "And we shall overcome," he said. 2 weeks later, with federal protection, King and thousands of marchers finally made the journey from Selma to Montgomery. It took 5 days. They camped in fields. They sang. They prayed. When they reached Montgomery, 25,000 people were waiting. King spoke on the steps of the state capitol building, the same building where Jefferson Davis had been inaugurated as President of the Confederacy. 5 months later, on August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. It prohibited literacy tests and authorized federal oversight of elections in areas with histories of discrimination. It was one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. And it happened because people were willing to march across a bridge and get beaten for the right to vote. But for Martin Luther King Jr., the victories of 1964 and 1965 were bittersweet. Yes, laws had changed. But he was starting to see that legal equality was not the same as actual equality. A black person could now legally eat at any restaurant. But what if they couldn't afford the meal? A black person could now legally vote. But what if they lived in a neighborhood with failing schools and no jobs? King began to realize that the next phase of the struggle would be even harder than what came before. Because now they weren't just fighting racist laws. They were fighting poverty. They were fighting economic systems. They were fighting the structures that kept people trapped, regardless of what the law said. And he was about to discover that when you challenge economic power, the opposition gets far more dangerous. By 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. had changed America. Jim Crow was dead. Black people could vote. The laws had been rewritten. But King looked around and saw that for millions of black Americans, very little had actually changed. They still lived in slums. They still couldn't find decent jobs. Their children still went to terrible schools. They were free in law but trapped in poverty. And it wasn't just black people. Poor white people in Appalachia. Mexican-American farmworkers in California. Native Americans on reservations. Poverty was crushing people of every race. King began saying something that made people uncomfortable. What good is it to be allowed to eat at a lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger? In 1966, he took the movement to Chicago to fight segregated housing. The North liked to think it was better than the South. No whites only signs. No legal segregation. But the reality was just as brutal, just hidden better. In Chicago, real estate agents refused to show houses in white neighborhoods to black families. Banks refused to give mortgages to black buyers. Landlords packed black families into overpriced slums and refused to make repairs. King moved into a Chicago apartment to understand what people were living with. The building was falling apart. Rats in the walls. No heat in winter. But the rent was high because black people had nowhere else to go. He organized marches into white neighborhoods. And he encountered hatred as intense as anything in the South. Crowds of white people, thousands strong, throwing bottles, bricks, screaming racial slurs. During one march, a rock hit King in the head. He fell to his knees. Later he said, "I have never seen such hate. Not in Mississippi or Alabama. This is a terrible thing." Chicago taught him something painful. Southern racism was obvious. It was written into law. You could fight it in court and win. But Northern racism was different. It was in bank policies. Real estate practices. School district boundaries. It was systemic. And it was protected by people who swore they weren't racist. At the same time, King's eyes turned to Vietnam. America was dropping more bombs on Vietnam than had been dropped in all of World War II. Young men, disproportionately poor, disproportionately black, were being drafted and sent to die. The government said there was no money for schools or housing or jobs. But there was unlimited money for war. King struggled with whether to speak out. His advisors told him not to. Don't alienate President Johnson. Don't divide the movement. Stay in your lane. But King couldn't stay silent. On April 4, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, he gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York that shook the nation. He called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He said the war was destroying Vietnamese villages and American souls. He said a nation that spent billions on war while its own people lived in poverty was approaching spiritual death. He said he could not be silent about an unjust war while preaching nonviolence at home. That would make him a hypocrite. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The New York Times called him irresponsible. The Washington Post said he had diminished his usefulness. Other civil rights leaders publicly criticized him. His allies begged him to back down. King refused. He said that justice and peace were connected. That you couldn't have one without the other. That his commitment to nonviolence applied everywhere or it applied nowhere. The FBI, which had been surveilling King for years, intensified its efforts. J. Edgar Hoover saw King as a threat to national security. They wiretapped his phones. They tried to blackmail him. They sent him an anonymous letter urging him to commit suicide. Through 1967 and into 1968, King became more radical. He started talking about democratic socialism. About guaranteed income for the poor. About restructuring the economy. He said, true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It demands that we create a society in which there are no beggars. He began planning the Poor People's Campaign. The idea was to bring thousands of poor people to Washington, people of every race, and build a tent city on the National Mall. Stay there until the government addressed poverty. It was ambitious. Risky. Many thought it was doomed to fail. But King believed it was necessary. He was convinced that economic justice was the next frontier. But before the Poor People's Campaign could launch, something happened in Memphis, Tennessee. In February 1968, 2 black sanitation workers in Memphis, Echal Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death in a garbage truck. The city gave their families almost nothing. No benefits. No compensation. Nothing. It was the final insult for Memphis sanitation workers who had endured terrible conditions for years. Low pay. Dangerous equipment. No respect. They went on strike. Their demand was simple and powerful. They carried signs that said, I am a man. Not asking for much. Just recognition of their basic humanity. The city refused to negotiate. The police attacked strikers. And the situation grew more tense. King was asked to come to Memphis to support the workers. He agreed. This was exactly what he'd been talking about. Economic justice. Dignity for workers. He came to Memphis in March. He led a march. But some young people at the back of the march broke store windows. Police responded with violence. A teenager named Larry Payne was killed. King was devastated. His commitment to nonviolence had been compromised. He decided he had to return to Memphis to prove that nonviolent protest could still work. On April 3, 1968, King returned to Memphis. That night, there was a meeting at Mason Temple. King almost didn't go. He was exhausted. He'd been receiving more death threats than usual. But his aide Ralph Abernathy called and said the people really wanted to see him. So King went. He gave a speech that night that seemed to predict his own death. He talked about the bomb threats against his plane. He talked about the dangers facing the movement. And then he said something that has echoed through history. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. The crowd was on its feet, weeping, shouting. King left the pulpit emotionally spent. The next day, April 4, 1968, King spent the afternoon at the Lorraine Motel, where he was staying. Room 306. He was getting ready to go to dinner at a local minister's house. Around 6 p.m., he stepped out onto the balcony. He was talking with his friends down in the parking lot. Joking. Relaxed. At 6:01 p.m., a single rifle shot rang out. The bullet hit King in the jaw and neck. He collapsed. His friends ran to him. There was blood everywhere. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital. At 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The man who killed him, James Earl Ray, was later captured and convicted. But the question of whether Ray acted alone or as part of a larger conspiracy has never been fully answered. When news of King's assassination spread, America exploded. Riots erupted in more than 100 cities. Washington, D.C., burned. Chicago burned. Baltimore burned. People were angry. Devastated. The apostle of nonviolence had been murdered. And many asked, what was the point of nonviolence if this is where it led? But others remembered what King had said. That the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That we must accept finite disappointment but never lose infinite hope. For days after King's death, on April 8, Coretta Scott King led the march King had planned in Memphis. 20,000 people marched in complete silence. In his absence, they honored his method. 9 days after his death, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the last major piece of civil rights legislation of the era. It prohibited discrimination in housing. It was a final tribute to King's work, passed in the shadow of his assassination. Coretta Scott King spent the rest of her life carrying forward his legacy. She founded the King Center in Atlanta. She pushed for a national holiday in his honor. She was a leader in her own right, often overlooked but absolutely essential. In 1986, Martin Luther King Jr. Day became a federal holiday. The third Monday of every January. A day to honor the man and to remember what he stood for. Today, King's words are quoted in schools and churches and political speeches. His "I Have a Dream" speech is taught to children. His image is on monuments and postage stamps. But King would want us to remember more than the dream. He would want us to remember that he was beaten and arrested. That his house was bombed. That he was stabbed and almost died in Harlem in 1958. That he spent time in jail cells across the South. He would want us to remember that he opposed war and poverty, not just segregation. That he believed in economic justice, not just legal equality. He would want us to know that he wasn't safe. He wasn't comfortable. He was dangerous to those in power because he told uncomfortable truths. King once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." He stood in those moments. Again and again and again. And his legacy is not just what he accomplished. It's the example he set. That one person, armed only with conviction and courage, can change the world. That moral authority is more powerful than political power. That love is stronger than hate. But his legacy is also unfinished. The Selma Bridge was renamed in honor of John Lewis, who marched across it and had his skull fractured. But voting rights are still under attack in America. The Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination. But economic inequality is worse now than it was in King's time. King dreamed of a day when people would be judged by the content of their character. But racism, though changed in form, persists. He would not want us to simply celebrate him. He would want us to continue the work. To stand up when it's uncomfortable. To speak out when it's risky. To choose justice over safety. In Memphis, at the National Civil Rights Museum, built at the Lorraine Motel where King died, you can stand on the balcony where he stood. You can see the spot where he fell. And you can see, across the street, the boarding house window where the shot came from. It's a sobering place. A reminder that speaking truth to power has consequences. That moral leadership requires sacrifice. But inside the museum, there's another message. The movement didn't die with King. It continued. New leaders emerged. New battles were fought. Progress, however slow, continued. Because that's what King understood. That the movement was never about one man. It was about a people finding their voice. A nation confronting its conscience. A long, difficult journey toward justice. King said it best himself in his final speech. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now. Because I've been to the mountaintop. He had seen what was possible. A nation where people were truly equal. Where poverty was eliminated. Where war was no longer the answer. Where love conquered hate. He didn't live to see it fully realized. None of us have. But he showed us it was possible. He showed us the way. Through nonviolence. Through moral courage. Through refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Today, his words still challenge us. His example still inspires us. His dream still calls to us. Because Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a historical figure. He's not just someone we remember on a holiday. He's a question we have to answer. When you see injustice, what will you do? When you hear hate, what will you say? When you have to choose between comfort and conscience, which will you choose? King chose. Again and again, at tremendous cost, he chose justice over safety. He chose courage over fear. He chose love over hate. He was born into a world that told him he was less than human. He died trying to build a world where everyone was treated as fully human. He was a pastor's son from Atlanta who became the conscience of a nation. A man who never held political office but changed the course of history. A prophet who saw what could be and demanded that America live up to its ideals. His voice was silenced on a Memphis balcony in 1968. But his words still echo. His dream still lives. His challenge still stands. Not just to remember him. But to continue what he started. To bend that long arc of the moral universe toward justice. To refuse to accept inequality. To refuse to stay silent. To refuse to wait. Because as King taught us, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. He refused to be silent. And because he spoke, America changed. This is the story of Martin Luther King Jr., not a perfect man, but a courageous one. Not a saint, but a servant. Not a hero without fear, but a leader who acted despite his fear. A man who believed that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. A man who proved that one voice, speaking truth, can shake a nation. A man whose dream is not yet fully realized, but whose legacy reminds us that it can be. Martin Luther King Jr. lived for 39 years. But his impact will last forever. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was deeply, courageously human. Because he saw injustice and refused to accept it. Because he heard the cries of the oppressed and refused to ignore them. Because he believed, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, that people could change. That America could change. That the world could change. And he was right. The laws changed. The culture changed. Opportunities opened. Barriers fell. Not all of them. Not quickly enough. Not completely. But they changed because people like Martin Luther King Jr. demanded it. Because people marched. Because people suffered. Because people refused to give up. Today, when you stand up for someone being treated unfairly, you honor King's legacy. When you speak out against injustice, even when it's unpopular, you honor King's legacy. When you choose love over hate, dialogue over violence, hope over despair, you honor King's legacy. His dream was never just about black and white. It was about human dignity. About treating every person as valuable. About building a society where everyone has a chance, everyone has a voice, everyone matters. That dream is still alive. Not because it's been achieved, but because every generation chooses whether to carry it forward or let it die. Martin Luther King Jr. carried it forward. At tremendous cost, he carried it forward. And when an assassin's bullet took his life, thousands picked up where he left off. Today, it's our turn. His dream is now our responsibility. His unfinished work is now our work. His question to America is now our question. Will we be satisfied with how things are? Or will we fight for what they should be? Will we accept injustice as inevitable? Or will we challenge it as intolerable? Will we wait for someone else to lead? Or will we find the courage to stand up ourselves? These are the questions Martin Luther King Jr. forces us to ask. And they're uncomfortable questions. Because they demand something from us. They demand action, not just admiration. Commitment, not just commemoration. King didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to be followed. Not blindly, but thoughtfully. Not into violence, but into love. Not into hatred, but into justice. And so we end where we began. With a man in a jail cell, writing words that would change the world. With a pastor on church steps, speaking a dream that would echo through history. With a leader on a Memphis balcony, giving his life for a cause greater than himself. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, and died on April 4, 1968. 39 years on earth. But a lifetime of impact. He showed us that one person can make a difference. That nonviolence can be powerful. That love can conquer hate. That justice is possible. That dreams matter. And he left us with a challenge. Not to simply remember him, but to continue his work. To pick up where he left off. To finish what he started. Because the arc of the moral universe doesn't bend itself. People bend it. People like Martin Luther King Jr., people like Rosa Parks and John Lewis and countless others whose names we don't know but whose courage changed everything. And people like you. The dream is not dead. It lives in every person who refuses to accept injustice. In every voice raised against hatred. In every hand extended across divides. In every heart that chooses love over fear. This is Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. Not a monument or a holiday or a quote on a poster. But a living, breathing challenge to each of us. To stand up. To speak out. To make a difference. To believe, as he believed, that we can build a better world. And then to do the hard, daily work of building it. That is how we truly honor Martin Luther King Jr. not by remembering what he did. But by continuing what he started. The dream lives. If we choose to carry it forward. If this story moved you, if King's courage inspired you, if his dream still speaks to your heart, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button to help us reach more people with stories that matter. And subscribe to our channel because we're bringing you more untold stories of courage, sacrifice, and the people who changed our world. History isn't just something that happened. It's something we're still writing. Together, let's make sure the next chapter is worth telling.